I was in a school the other day, and I was looking at the revision of their assessment system with them. And I want you to bear this in mind throughout the next 20 minutes of my presentation. They said, yeah, we understand why it was important to get rid of levels. It's a very big, very preeminent secondary institution. We understand the rationale for getting rid of levels. So we've got rid of levels by introducing this new 10-level framework. Okay. Now, I explained patiently why this was a bit contradictory, and it was actually quite a serious issue. The development of the revised assessment arrangements had been given to the new head of history, who knew very little about assessment, in fact, and so it wasn't her fault. I wrote quite an extensive paper when I got back to the office in Cambridge, very carefully unpicked what they'd done and said why this is going to lead to problems of not being able to identify the children who needed additional support to continue to keep pace with other children. And when I contacted them a few weeks later, she said it was a very interesting paper and we've decided to go ahead with what we planned. And largely because, you know, they had done it. They didn't have any other opportunity to change everything. They disseminated it to the staff. Now, regrettably, an awful lot of schools are in that position. So I just want to go back over some stuff which some of you have heard already, just to remind us of the rationale for why we got rid of levels, because I think it was compelling. And before I do that, I'm going to read out some stuff on a pretty relevant issue, and that's grammar schools. And I'm going to read out some stuff about it because it really highlights this issue about what we should do about curriculum and assessment. The grammar schools policy is likely to dominate educational discourse for a considerable time. It runs the risk of taking attention away from the really central issues in education, the quality of classroom teaching, standards being attained, and the detailed strategies on maths and textbooks, all of which are essential to improving equity and attainment. Structural change is not an irrelevance, but it must not draw attention or indeed funding away from the curriculum reform which has been a laudable feature of the last 5 years of educational policy. Now, why on earth do I say that? Because of the international evidence. Now, around the world, there are examples of great and very poor selective systems. Around the world, there are examples of great and very poor comprehensive systems. Now, that's really important evidence. We work very closely with Singapore, and many of the empirical findings from evaluation of high-quality education in Singapore were fed into the removal of levels. Hong Kong is amazingly selective, and yet over the last 40 years they have both improved attainment dramatically and improved equity, and enjoyment, actually. So around the world we have high-quality selective systems: Hong Kong, Singapore, the Netherlands. Anybody aware that the Netherlands, amazingly selective system? People go into a vocational track at the age of 10 or 11. Switzerland, one of the hidden high performers in PISA and TIMSS, highly selective. So does that mean that selective education is a good thing? And that's exactly what we should have in every locality in this country? No, because on the other side we've got good comprehensive. Alberta, Finland, Massachusetts. So what does that actually tell us? What it tells us is that if we jump one way to selective or the other to comprehensive, we have to do different things to ensure attainment and equity. But always what we have to do relates to the quality of the curriculum, relates to the quality of learning, and relates to the quality of assessment. So I think some of the reasons that people are objecting to what actually basically was a policy related to the minor expansion of some grammar schools, but let's face it, ideologically it's one of the biggest red buttons that you can possibly press in relationship to thinking about education in this country. What we should think about in respect of that is back to the underpinning rationale around the curriculum, back to what we should do around assessment. And what is notable in those high-quality, high-performing selective systems is that people on the other route, you know, the route into which is considered to be the slightly lower status route. What you will find there is very high quality, broad and balanced education. In the Netherlands, yes, with a vocational focus. And you'll find well-funded institutions with high-quality teachers. So the issue for us, I think, around selection is we mustn't make it a low-grade curriculum of a self-fulfilling prophecy with less committed teachers. You know, and that's what we've learnt from history. In summary, we shouldn't let it distract us from the very things which I'm just about to talk about. So we have got an awful lot going on. So elevated attainment, enhanced equity, international alignments are critical. We've thought hard about what we should learn from these other systems. Entitlement, every child in this country getting access to all of the national curriculum. Those are what we've stated as driving us, and that's good news. All of these things have happened. The National Curriculum Review, the expert panel, and Her Majesty's government activity. There's been the BEW review of assessment, John McIntosh's review of assessment, and I commend the report to you. The autonomy argument, increasing control of head teachers, revision of inspection, canonisation, and so on. All of these things, right down to the government's commitment to revision of textbooks. Is this hyperactivity, as Graham Stewart said of Michael Gave and the Select Committee, or is it, which is what it is, attention to curriculum coherence, making sure that all of these things align? And that's one of the things we learned from international scrutiny of international scrutiny of other systems and transnational comparisons. Bill Schmidt and Richard Parrott's work, that in high-performing systems, all of the different elements of the system align. So it is inevitable that we had to have policy in all of those areas. And I think the important thing is it was consciously done to align the drivers and incentives across the system and not pull teachers in conflicted directions. We're not there yet, but we're getting there, not least because the underpinning aims are good. So, you know, you're fed up with me putting this up, but it is important. The 95 curriculum was brilliant and full of good stuff. When chemical reactions take place, mass is conserved. Counterintuitive, very hard for young people to acquire. Decaying in our 11-year-olds, Michael Scher's analysis, really important. Difficult to understand and achieve. When we had the 2007 curriculum, all of that rich conceptual stuff had been taken out. There are patterns in the chemical reactions between substances. That is chemistry, so what do you teach? Where have all the hard, counterintuitive concepts, which are fundamental to educational progression and good life outcomes, where has it gone? So we put it back in. That was what we did through the international comparisons in the National Curriculum Review. So the first point about moving to a world without levels is a construct focus. Now what's important about that? What's really important about that? Well, Daisy Christodoulou recently was doing some observation in schools, and she found that in primary schools, when children were dealing with these which are fundamentally counterintuitive ideas, often teachers would pull back at the point at which the child was showing that they were uncomfortable. But we know from Vygotsky that's exactly the point at which the learning occurs. The movement from an existing conceptual array to a new conceptual array. A recognition that some things get heavier when they oxidize, when they burn, magnesium. Counterintuitive. It is often uncomfortable. And if you look at the films of very early infants doing things, even putting one block on top of another, they're not laughing much. They're often concentrating really, really hard. It's difficult. What they're observing and doing is challenging what they currently think. So of course it's not going to be comfortable. And the person involved in doing all that work is the two people, Mark Warner and Lisa Jardine-Wright at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. Lisa said recently, right, all this stuff that we've been discussing has caused me to stop doing some things that I did in undergraduate physics at Cambridge. I now stop and I check whether the kids coming up to us actually understand fundamental laws and whether they are secure in a whole series of fundamental concepts. Because I was making the assumption that they were, and it turns out that they're not. And that's why some of them struggle. And Mary and I were discussing fewer things in greater depth in primary. And Lisa's now doing that in first year undergraduate in Cambridge. Very interesting. And this is why construct focus is really important in everything that we do. What is the idea that we are trying to get this child to understand? That's the first thing about assessment without levels. There are ideas behind the revision of the national curriculum. Some people are approaching it just as a change in content. You know, how have the key stage 2 requirements in mathematics changed? But there are so many ideas that drove that change. And it's been very hard to get the ideas out. I mean, the department hasn't done a great job at getting the rationale for the changes out. Hence these kind of meetings. Many of the things that we've had to do in education have taken us away from these ideas. You know, moving everybody on and getting maximum pace through the levels, getting a few more to level 4, thus saving the school from special measures. That's not about getting everyone to an understanding of all of the national curriculum. And yet that was what was in the 88 Act. That's what remains the legal obligation on all of us in schools to achieve. So the legal obligation is this, not just some kids, not just 5% more this year getting level 4, but all kids getting access to all of that content. And that content is now really good. We could have just gone back to the 95 curriculum, but we decided to use international comparisons for the first time to make sure that it was really on the ball in terms of the content. So it is high attainment, high equity, and high enjoyment. Now, why get rid of levels? I mean, the evidence was just overwhelming and was just there in a huge stack. And it is worrying as to why people have thought they got rid of levels but returned to old behaviours. It's worrying but understandable, because there are so many things about our previous experience, about the pressures on schools, which have caused people to regress. But we've got to remember what we really should be doing on the basis of evidence. So why get rid of levels? Well, one of the key things in assessment is that if you give any child a label, you know, that child is level 3, and they carry that label around with them, that summary, it's got to mean something, and it's got to mean the same thing to different people, whether they're an inspector, a receiving institution, a head, or another teacher. The trouble is, it didn't mean the same thing at all, not least because it was derived in different ways. So you could be level 3 because you got a particular score on a national test, and remember, those marks could have come from anywhere. There could be big gaps in your achievement and understanding, and you were level 3 with a particular set of marks, but another child would have different gaps, so they were a different level 3. Best fit. APP, of course, was based on best fit. And move on quickly, because we've got to have pace in our curriculum. And best fit, again, means that there could be gaps. But again, different to just getting a score from anywhere. And often APP was triggered because, oh look, that child has mentioned that word, so they must have gone up a sub-level. Threshold. Just in level 4, phew, we won't go into special measures, but when that child goes up to secondary school, they're alongside other children who are level 4, who are banging their head against the top of level 4. And those kids are not the same at all. In fact, that kid just in level 4 is more like somebody in level 3 than that person who is up to 18 months, 2 years ahead, and is also level 4. I mean, these are really serious matters, actually. And that's why so many secondary school teachers did not trust the assessments coming up from primary school. The levels have been assiduously applied, but applied in incredibly different ways. So the same label literally meant something different. That's no good in assessment. You know, if I go to a doctor and want to be assured that they know certain things, I really want to know that they know certain things. So there was poor construct integrity. It beats me as to why there were 8 levels in science as well as 8 levels in English, because the structure of knowledge in the 2 domains are entirely different. Tom Bramley said, you know, that if you look at what somebody can do who's got level 4 at the age of 11, it's very different from getting level 4 at the age of 9. Different sort of kids, different texture of attainment. John Blake looked at if people were a particular level from secondary, how could that predict their attainment in history? In fact, it was all over the place. And we want assessment to have good predictive validity too. Contradictions between the school and the state. because the state was using numbers derived from certain processes, like the Key Stage 2 tests, whereas the schools were making judgments about children based on observation. Same level, different interpretation of the children's attainment. Poor communication with parents. Your child's level 4. Is that good? Well, it's the national average. And then the parental consultation would go into what was meaningful, what the child was good or bad at, strengths and weaknesses. So you see, the meaningful discourse takes place at a lower level of granularity. Undue pace, moving children on before you really check their understanding. Labelling, and this is bad, because the whole point about levels was to enable each and every child to show that they were progressing and not be labelled grade D, grade D, grade D all the way through their education. But we know children will wander around saying, I'm 3A, whereas all my friends are, and corrosive of primary-secondary links. Today in the system we have all of those things, and some of them are very good. The phonics check is brilliant. It's a really good thing for primary schools to sort out how well their kids can read. A cut score of 32 is a really bad idea, because mysteriously you look at the data, and how is it that so many of our kids can miraculously score 33? So it's a good idea, very bad idea to have a cut score. You see how easily a well-intended, well-designed assessment can go wrong. We've revised GCSE, including introducing the English Baccalaureate, and these changes are good and they're sound, I think. A lot of discussion about teacher assessment. So a lot of change going on, but we have to understand the rationale. Now all I'm doing here is actually showing the difference between a summary level, like this child is 3B, and what we should be doing. Remember the conceptual content. Remember the difficulty of the concepts. Remember the difference between diffraction and diffusion. Remember the difference between metaphor and analogy. These are tight conceptual distinctions that you need to make. So this is a real test at the end of half term in David Perk's East London Science Free School, and Summer Turner has just produced a brilliant book on assessment, which I commend to you. The questions are good. The questions have been selected to match the constructs that were being delivered in that particular term, and it's a check on whether they can understand it. And apparently cytoplasm is the gooey stuff. Okay? And what the teacher said was, oh my God, I think that's how I first introduced it. So we know that the first memory laid down is the first one you access. That's why most of you spell receipt wrongly. You then have to access a secondary memory when you've corrected the misspelling. So in a warm summer examination room, probably this is what the 16-year-old will first think of as being cytoplasm. And then we'll access a secondary memory, which hopefully has been laid down through some additional teaching. Because otherwise, if we have a levels mentality, what we would do, when all the results from that test have been put into a free database, we'd say it's mostly green, so we'll move on. They've reached, level 4, whatever, so we'll move on. Except that, look, the reds are against 26 and 19, and it's all the kids. In fact, there are 30 records, of course. And you look back and it's not a bad question, and all the kids have got it wrong. So you should go back, and you should embed that proper secondary memory of cytoplasm. I've emphasised all the time that practice is possible in a curriculum which emphasises fewer things in greater depth and nails the constructs. You can have rich, exciting practice in mathematics if you do that. And we need loads more practice, because this kid will get it here and this kid will get it here. But if you never give that much practice, they never get access to the setting which just unlocks their understanding on that particular occasion for them, and suddenly the light bulb goes on. You need to have kids producing loads of things. Why? Because if they say things and write things, they can reflect on it. And there's a brilliant photograph from the film from Wroxham where children are looking at a thick workbook, discussing each other's work. But they're not just discussing each other's work, they're thinking about their own thinking, and they're discussing each other's thinking about a particular idea, about a construct. And if you produce loads of stuff, it means that people like Mary won't be relying on your data alone, but can actually see the genuine progress that children have made, because they can look at the workbook, they can open it at page 2 or 3 at the beginning of the term and see where the kids were, and they can open it at page 40 or 50 and see where the kids have got to. That's real progress. Exposure. Yeah, sure, conservation of masses in Key Stage 3, but kids should be exposed to it in Key Stage 1, because then it builds up. They should be demonstrating it in Key Stage 3. That's why our national curriculum is a bit illusory. It's not a curriculum, it's a framework of standards, things to be achieved by particular ages. We should have rich question and answer going on in the classroom about these constructs. We should have granular analytic assessment, not levels, but that stuff, at the level of tests, at the level of the constructs, recording at a granular level, analysing the quality of the teaching going back. Recognising always that summarising involves information loss. It loses that brilliant information in the red crosses. There's an extraordinary book about to come out. It's called Cleverlands by Lucy Crehan, and it's fascinating. Okay, it's a really good book. She was a young teacher, and she was so fed up with what was happening with teaching because of not being able to concentrate on the constructs, being driven in the wrong direction by the administrative arrangements, not least the framework of assessment in the school, that she said she would teach in a range of countries, and she just phoned up schools in Finland, Japan, Canada, and said, can I go and teach? Can I come and teach in your school? And they said, yeah, fine. So off she went. And she's documented what she found, she's linked it to theory, and it's in this book, Cleverlands. What she found was that in Shanghai, it looks like this, you know, serried ranks of people listening, but not like this, because actually just looking at it doesn't tell you what's going on. In fact, in Shanghai classrooms, there are up to 120 questions, rich questions, asked of the children in a 35-minute lesson. And the teacher doesn't give the answer. They'll ask 5 kids to give the answer to the question, and then discuss why the answers vary. Very, very interesting. Incredibly rich Q&A. Lisa Jardine Wright, Cambridge Assessment. We've got an archive, and yes, the archivists are quite large-eyed and white-skinned because they spend a lot of time in dark corridors. And we've got exam papers going back to 1898. Now, Lisa Jardine Wright and Mark Warner are leading-edge physicists, and they and their postgrad students have gone through all our archives of exam questions. And they have found what we suspected through other empirical work at Cambridge, which is that standards in physics A-level have gone down over the last 40 years. They've gone down because we've made the questions slightly easier each year. That bit of scaffolding, that diagram where there wasn't one before, that formula that you don't need to remember anymore, breaking down the question a bit more. You do it each year, just a tiny bit, doesn't look as though you've done anything. Do it for 40 years, you've made it a hell of a lot easier. Now, we knew that from the data. And, and please, I know that some of you are thinking, yeah, but in 1980, in 1960, so few people took physics. And they were all high ability, so they weren't getting many marks to get an A. Neither of those things are true. The number of people taking physics at A-level has halved since then. Halved. So there were more people doing physics then, and I've looked at the examiner reports. They were having to get a lot of marks to get an A. They knew more physics, and they knew more maths. Now, you could say, oh, doom and gloom, so great Daily Mail story. The education system's gone to the dogs. You know, it's all terrible. No, it isn't. Why do we know it isn't bad? Firstly, we've spotted it, hence the standards debate that we started from Cambridge in 2010, leading to a revision of GCSEs and the A-levels, and supporting the National Curriculum Review. Knowing which constructs to put in, what level they should be at, and understanding the sequencing, and making sure that the textbooks supported that. We've done all of that, so that's good news. And good news is textbook sales are going up. Cavendish have made this available through Isaac Physics. It's a good question. I mean, a steam train, that kind of gives it away, but it's good. And they haven't made the question easier, they provided a series of hints. They haven't provided the answers to the questions, which is interesting. So they're rich, they're online, they are demanding, and they're used by teachers and by students. Good news is, after only a few months, 10,000 hits a day on these items. In other words, we're not in a terrible situation because young people want these hard things. They want to explore them. They want to explore them on their phone, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and on Sundays. It's the stuff which counts. It's the hard ideas. It's granular assessment, not labels. It's fewer things in greater depth that kids really understand and are embedded in memory. And the great thing is, children actually want it.